The crown is not just a piece of jewelry. It is a weight that can crush the spirit of those who wear it, and a prize that can drive those in its shadow to madness. For centuries, the ancient stone walls of Buckingham Palace have whispered of betrayal, but in the early summer of 2026, those whispers turned into a deafening roar of total war. This was not the typical tabloid fodder of years past. This was a fundamental fracture in the House of Windsor, a strategic and brutal campaign that would redefine the future of the British monarchy. It began with a single article, a calculated strike designed to dismantle the reputation of the heir to the throne. But this was no ordinary media leak. This was a sophisticated hit job, engineered from within the very heart of the Queen's court, intended to permanently alter the line of succession. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, you must first understand the man behind the curtain. Imagine a figure who knows every dark corner of the British media landscape, a man with decades of experience in the art of the psychological takedown. That man is Tobit Andre, a legendary former senior editor at the most influential newspapers in the country. Andre now serves with absolute, unwavering loyalty as the Director of Communications for Queen Camilla. He is not merely a press secretary, he is a master of systemic influence and institutional knowledge. In the late spring of 2026, Andre utilized his vast array of tabloid techniques to dress up a devastating press hit job as an intimate, superficial portrait of the private life of William, the Prince of Wales. The article appeared in the Sunday edition of the Daily Mail, and to the untrained public eye, it seemed almost affectionate. It presented a harmless, blockish narrative of William as a man of the people, enjoying discreet pints of Stella Artois with his lifelong band of loyal friends in the quiet corners of West London pubs. It told charming stories of the prince using clever disguises and iffy Welsh accents to escape public scrutiny and enjoy a moment of normalcy. However, embedded within this hagiography were calculated narrative grenades. These were not accidental observations. They were precision, engineered to permanently damage the prince's standing among the core royalist demographic. The core of the Tobit Andre briefing campaign targeted William as an inherently lazy and entitled heir. The article explicitly labeled him a work-shy, 9-to-5 prince who disdained what the briefings called performative monarchy. The text suggested that William actively avoided the grueling, unglamorous realities of state service in favor of a comfortable, shielded life. But the weaponized center of this Daily Mail attack was far more specific. It accused the Prince of Wales of flatly refusing to commit to an essential diplomatic and charitable visit to Jamaica. This was not just any visit. It was a crucial trip to a Commonwealth realm that had been completely devastated by the catastrophic forces of Hurricane Melissa a full 6 months prior. The briefing falsely framed William's choice as a petulant avoidance of international duty. It suggested that the prince refused to travel unless the destination aligned with his narrow interest in high-level global initiatives like his Earthshot Prize. This was a direct strike at William's character, painting him as a man who would abandon a nation in crisis because the optics didn't suit his personal brand. Behind this relentless media offensive lay Queen Camilla's own deepening pool of personal jealousy and structural anxiety. Throughout the exhausting months of May and early June of 2026, the atmosphere inside the private apartments of Buckingham Palace had turned toxic. Camilla had grown increasingly vocal regarding the distribution of constitutional labor. She openly complained that she and King Charles III were forced to endure the physical toll of long-haul flights and grueling international state visits. This was happening while the king continued his private and harrowing treatment for an ongoing oncological diagnosis. Camilla's bitterness centered on the fact that while she and a battling king were on the front lines, William and Catherine remained comfortably grounded. She viewed their domestic engagements as high-value public relations wins that required minimal physical toll compared to the king's exhausting schedule. Camilla expanded her critique into a sweeping, cynical evaluation of royal duties. She deliberately contrasted her own nonstop visibility with the intensely guarded recovery period of Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Catherine was at the time navigating her delicate post-chemotherapy rehabilitation, a period the public largely respected. However, Camilla went a step further, tactically weaponizing the exceptionally dense itinerary of Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. Throughout late May, Sophie had undertaken an exhausting series of diplomatic engagements, flying from summits in Switzerland to a demanding state visit to Portugal, which concluded on June 2nd, 2026. Camilla cynically attempted to use Sophie's grueling schedule as a political club to batter Kensington Palace. She loudly demanded to know why a dedicated duchess could traverse continental Europe in service to the state while a healthy 43-year-old Prince of Wales stubbornly remained at Anmer Hall. But the true, underlying motive for this comparative campaign was not a desire for fairness. It was the calculated creation of an institutional vacuum. Camilla intended to aggressively fill this void with her own daughter, Laura Lopes. The Queen argued that the severe deficit of available working royals during this period of extreme health crises required a formal introduction of new blood. She cited Laura's specialized degree in aesthetics and art curation as an ideal modern asset for the monarchy. This was the first move in a grander scheme to plant a non-royal lineage into the state-funded apparatus of the British monarchy. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, one that ignored the historical sanctity of the bloodline. Camilla believed that by painting William as lazy and Catherine as unavailable, she could force the hand of the establishment to accept her own family as the necessary solution. Little did she know, her media machine was about to make a fatal mistake by targeting the one person Duchess Sophie would burn the palace down to protect. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave no one unscathed. In the high-stakes game of palace politics, there is an unwritten, silent rule that has governed the British monarchy for generations. You do not target the children. You do not weaponize the vulnerabilities of the young to settle adult scores. But as the first days of June 2026 unfolded, it became tragically clear that for the faction surrounding Queen Camilla, all rules had been discarded in favor of a ruthless, total war strategy. The hit job on Prince William was merely the opening salvo. The true, heartless center of this media offensive was the calculated bullying of a young woman who had never sought the chaotic spotlight of tabloid warfare, Lady Louise Windsor. To understand why this happened, we must look at the structural vacuum Queen Camilla was desperate to fill. With the king battling his oncological diagnosis and the Princess of Wales in the midst of her post-chemotherapy rehabilitation, the roster of working royals had grown dangerously thin. Camilla saw this not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. She wanted to bridge the gap by introducing her own daughter, Laura Lopes, into the official tax-funded apparatus of the monarchy. However, there was a significant obstacle in her path. The British public already had a young, hardworking, and deeply beloved female royal who embodied the traditional values of the crown. That person was Lady Louise Windsor. The strategy deployed by Tobit Andre and the Queen's media allies was as simple as it was cruel. To make Laura Lopes look like a necessary modern asset, they had to make Lady Louise look unfit for the throne. They began a whispering campaign that was eventually funneled into the pages of the British press, contrasting the two women in the most personal and hurtful ways possible. Camilla's camp publicly and privately contrasted her daughter's immaculate poise and visual brightness with what they described as the awkward and shy nature of Sophie's daughter. Lady Louise has always been the quiet, grounded heart of the Edinburgh household. While other young women of her status might spend their summers at high-end Mediterranean galas, Louise was at the University of St. Andrews, focusing on her studies and quietly continuing the carriage-driving legacy of her beloved late grandfather, Prince Philip. She was a young woman of substance over style, a trait the British public had come to adore. But in the eyes of the Queen's media machine, this humility was a weakness to be exploited. The bullying reached a fever pitch during the Royal Windsor Horse Show. It was here that Louise was photographed mid-May, working a humble, practical, part-time job. She was dressed in work clothes, focused on her tasks, and avoiding the cameras a true reflection of the late Prince Philip's get-on-with-it attitude. Camilla's camp seized these images, using them to argue that Louise lacked the necessary command and physical presence required for state representation. They suggested that Louise's shy demeanor and known visual vulnerabilities made her an institutional liability in a 21st century media age. This was a calculated character assassination. They used the term diffident, an old-world descriptor for someone timid and retiring to paint a picture of a young royal who was institutionally unfit. In contrast, they promoted Laura Lopes as possessing the sophisticated aesthetic maturity needed to assume high-level roles on the global stage. They cited Laura's degree in art curation as a vital modern credential, framing her as a polished professional who could handle the international summits that Louise, in their view, would shrink from. What Camilla and Tobit Andre failed to realize was that their attack was not just an insult to a young woman, it was an assault on the very concept of royal service. By mocking Louise's part-time work and her humble connection to her grandfather's legacy, they were mocking the values that the British public held most dear. They were suggesting that the monarchy should be a glamorous fashion show of aesthetics rather than a dedicated lifetime of quiet, unglamorous duty. Behind the scenes at Bagshot Park, the residence of the Edinburgh family, the reaction was one of absolute cold fury. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, has spent decades protecting her children from the predatory nature of the media. She had allowed Louise to grow up away from the camera specifically so she could develop the strength of character that Camilla was now trying to tear down. For Sophie, this was not just a palace grievance. It was a mother's worst nightmare. She watched as her daughter, a young bloodline royal who had done nothing but serve her family with dignity, was turned into a political stepping stone for a non-royal lineage. The Duchess of Edinburgh saw the move for what it truly was, an aggressive, hostile attempt by an ambitious stepmother to plant her own children into the state-funded structure of the British monarchy. It was a bridge too far. The shattered diplomatic composure of the Edinburgh court was the direct result of this heartless bullying. As the news of the briefings and the cruel comparisons reached the wider royal circle, a defensive alliance began to form. Prince William, who had watched his own wife endure years of tabloid intrusion and visual critique, felt a deep, visceral sympathy for his cousin Louise. The Queen's faction believed they were being clever. They believed that by targeting the weakest link in the chain, the shy, 22-year-old student, they could force a reorganization of the firm. They never expected that by attacking Louise, they would trigger a total war between the courts. They never expected that Sophie of Edinburgh, the woman known for her tireless work and quiet diplomacy, would be the one to light the fuse that would eventually burn down their entire media apparatus. The innocent victim had become the catalyst for the greatest institutional counteroffensive in modern royal history. And as the sun began to set on the Windsor Horse Show, the atmosphere was no longer one of celebration, but of a looming, inevitable explosion. The peaceful, green expanses of the Royal Windsor Horse Show have traditionally served as a sanctuary for the House of Windsor, a place where the late Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip felt most at home among their horses and their history. But in the early days of June 2026, the sanctuary was desecrated. The air was no longer filled with the simple sounds of carriage wheels and neighing horses. Instead, it crackled with the static of a brewing constitutional crisis. The explosive confrontation that took place there was not just a family spat. It was the moment the secret weapon of the monarchy, Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, finally snapped. Sophie has long been regarded as the most reliable, disciplined, and diplomatic member of the firm. Having navigated the treacherous waters of royal life for decades, she is a woman who understands the value of silence and the necessity of service. But even the most patient diplomat has a breaking point. And for Sophie, that point was the systematic destruction of her daughter's character to benefit an outsider. As the sun beat down on the Windsor grounds, the Duchess prepared to deliver a verbal broadside that would permanently sever the relationship between the Queen's apartments and the Edinburgh household. The confrontation began during an emergency summit regarding the pre-summer state calendar, held in a private pavilion away from the prying eyes of the public. Queen Camilla, emboldened by the recent Daily Mail article, had begun to reiterate her complaints about the uneven distribution of international travel. She once again pointed to Sophie's own punishing schedule, her summits in Switzerland, and her state visit to Portugal, which had only just concluded on June 2nd, as proof that the younger generation was failing to do their des n'est pas. Camilla was trying to frame Sophie as the hero in order to make William look like the villain, but Sophie saw through the flattery with clinical precision. She did not want to be a political club used to batter the heir to the throne. With a voice that courtiers described as ice-cold and unwavering, Sophie flatly rejected Camilla's self-serving comparisons. She told the Queen that her service to the crown was an act of pure loyalty, not a weapon to be used for factional warfare. She stated clearly that her grueling travel schedule was her choice, made in service to the king, and that it should never be used as a metric to shame a prince whose wife was fighting for her health. Then, the Duchess turned her attention to the most egregious betrayal, the media campaign against Lady Louise. Sophie did not mince words when addressing the blatant hypocrisy of Camilla's camp. She openly accused the Queen of using unprincipled greed and manipulative tactics to create an opening for Laura Lopes. The room fell silent as Sophie defended her daughter's quiet humility. She pointed out that, while Louise was at university, working a practical job and honoring Prince Philip's legacy, Camilla was trying to manufacture a role for an art curator who possessed no constitutional right to represent the British state. Sophie's fury was not just personal, it was constitutional. She issued a definitive declaration regarding the health and scheduling of the sovereign. She stated that the king's international and domestic itineraries must be determined solely by the highest medical assessments of his physical capacity, not by Camilla's desire for luxury and relief. In a devastating blow, Sophie accused the queen of putting her own personal comfort above the actual physical well-being of a reigning monarch who was privately battling a severe oncological crisis. It was a staggering accusation, one that painted the queen as a woman more concerned with her own status than her husband's health. The Duchess of Edinburgh fiercely pointed out the absurdity of the Lopes proposal. She noted that while William was managing his calendar around the profound family crisis of Catherine's post-chemotherapy rehabilitation, Camilla was actively attempting to exploit the royal labor shortage for personal elevation. Sophie's message was clear. The British public identified far more with Louise's quiet service and genuine connection to the bloodline than with the sudden, opportunistic insertion of a non-royal relative. This was the moment the Kensington-Edinburgh alliance became an unbreakable reality. Sophie was not just speaking for herself, she was speaking for the future of the firm. She was shielding Prince William, allowing him to remain focused on his wife and children, while she handled the frontline defense against the Queen's maneuvers. The confrontation marked a permanent severing of diplomatic relations. There would be no more polite smiles for the cameras, no more pretending that the two courts were aligned. As Sophie walked away from that pavilion, the dynamic of the palace had shifted. The Queen's attempt to paint William as lazy had been dismantled by the very person she tried to use as his opposite. The strategy of the tabloid assassin, Tobit Andre, had hit a brick wall of maternal and institutional fury. Sophie had shown the Queen that the bloodline royals would not be bullied, and that any attempt to diminish the status of Lady Louise would be treated as an act of open hostility against the stability of the crown itself. The explosive encounter at Windsor quickly reverberated through the ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace. Word reached the Prince of Wales at Kensington Palace that his aunt had stood her ground with devastating systemic force. William, moved by Sophie's bravery and loyalty, began to coordinate his own massive institutional response. The war had moved beyond words and into the realm of structural power. The secret weapon had fired her shot, and now, the heir to the throne was ready to deploy the financial and constitutional heavy artillery that would change the House of Windsor forever. The defensive alliance between the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Edinburgh had effectively created a powerful, modern superstructure within the monarchy, one that completely bypassed the traditionalist gatekeeping of Queen Camilla's apartments. While Sophie had fought the battle of words and maternal honor on the grounds of Windsor, Prince William was preparing a strike of a different nature. For William, the cruel targeting of Lady Louise Windsor and the ongoing media harassment of his own wife Catherine were not just personal insults, they were direct threats to the stability and sanctity of the throne. He recognized that the faction surrounding the Queen was attempting to exploit a period of profound family vulnerability to rewrite the rules of the monarchy. In response, the Prince of Wales chose to move from a position of quiet endurance to one of unforgiving clinical authority. He was no longer just the heir. He was the supreme administrator of the crown's future, and he was about to deploy a financial and constitutional guillotine. The first major retaliatory blow came in the final days of May 2026, a move that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the British establishment. Kensington Palace took the unprecedented step of independently opening the application process for the newly restructured royal warrants. To the average observer, a royal warrant might seem like a mere formality, a crest on a box of chocolates, or a bottle of gin, but in the world of global commerce and aristocratic prestige, they are the ultimate currency. These warrants grant businesses the lucrative right to display the royal coat of arms, driving immense financial value and marking a brand as the preferred choice of the sovereign. Historically, these had been managed with a heavy hand by Buckingham Palace, often used as a mechanism of institutional control and favoritism by the monarch's staff and the Queen's communications team. By launching an independent, autonomous portal for the royal warrants of the Prince and Princess of Wales, William completely dismantled the administrative control of Queen Camilla and her chief strategist, Tobit Andre. This was an economic masterstroke. It effectively established a separate, self-sustaining financial powerhouse centered entirely around Kensington Palace. William was signaling to the British business elite, the luxury brands of London, and the global aristocracy that the true economic and representational future of the crown rested with him, not with the transient faction currently occupying the king's apartments. The corporate world, always sensitive to the direction of power, reacted instantly. Major British corporations and international luxury brands began flooding the Kensington portal with their applications, effectively bypassing the machinery of the Queen's court. This massive shift in corporate allegiance stripped the Queen's faction of their ability to use the distribution of royal favors as a tool of influence. Simultaneously, William used this newfound economic leverage to issue a definitive constitutional directive regarding the future composition of the royal household. He ordered his senior aides to draft strict, unyielding guidelines for his upcoming reign, a document that courtiers have described as a declaration of exclusion. This directive explicitly states that Laura Lopes and any other non-royal children or relatives of Queen Camilla will be permanently and entirely excluded from the official roster of working royals. William's decree ensures that under his authority, no public funds, no state security details, and no official patronages will ever be allocated to Camilla's personal lineage. This bold move directly neutralized the Queen's desperate push to use the current royal labor shortage as a way to introduce her daughter into international state duties. William's response was a clear manifestation of his commitment to a slimmed-down, highly impactful monarchy that protects genuine servants of the crown like Lady Louise, while ruthlessly purging those who wish to cross the royal threshold for personal elevation. The administrative isolation of the Queen's faction deepened as William formally introduced his vision of an impact monarchy. This was not just a catchphrase, it was a total ideological shift. William used his public addresses and strategic briefings from Kensington Palace to disdain the traditional practice of a royal diary stuffed with hundreds of superficial engagements designed solely for the sake of visibility. Instead, the Prince of Wales insisted on fewer things done more deeply. He focused the entirety of his royal capital on long-term, structural solutions for global challenges, such as mental health, homelessness, and his signature Earthshot Prize initiatives. This modern doctrine effectively rendered the traditionalist arguments of Queen Camilla obsolete. He framed her reliance on constant, performative visibility as an outdated remnant of the Edwardian era, rather than a sustainable model for a 21st century sovereign state. The defensive shield provided by the Duchess of Edinburgh allowed William to coordinate this massive institutional response without being bogged down by accusations of family neglect. He felt a deep, visceral sympathy for the Edinburghs, recognizing the exact same tabloid patterns that had been used to torment Catherine during her darkest medical challenges. The prince watched with a cold, focused disgust as Tobin Andre's media operations attempted to frame his domestic focus as a lack of patriotism. William's inner circle knew that his decision to remain in the United Kingdom during the spring and early summer of 2026 was a non-negotiable vow to protect his three young children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, while ensuring that Catherine had an absolute sanctuary to fully recover away from the intrusive gaze of the press. The viciousness of the Daily Mail article only served to harden his resolve, transforming his sadness into a clinical determination to permanently neutralize the Queen's influence over the future of the firm. This protective stance extended directly to the wider royal circle, solidifying William's role as the de facto protector of the legitimate bloodline. He worked in absolute tandem with Prince Edward and Sophie, ensuring that the younger generation of royals who genuinely dedicated their lives to service were shielded from the toxic machinations of the Queen's non-royal faction. William made it known through discreet aristocratic channels that any attempt to diminish the status of Lady Louise Windsor would be treated as an act of open hostility against Kensington Palace itself. This powerful internal alignment completely paralyzed Camilla's ability to manipulate the court hierarchy as the senior, working members of the royal family stood united against the infiltration of outsiders who sought to use institutional vulnerability for personal enrichment. As the first week of June 2026 drew to a close, the results of William's counteroffensive were undeniable. The Queen and her chief strategist, Tobin Andre, were facing a total systemic blockade. Their media narrative had collapsed, their financial leverage had been severed, and their path to introducing a new lineage into the monarchy had been permanently barred. The Prince of Wales had shown that, while he was a man of modern sensibilities, he possessed the iron will of his ancestors when it came to defending the crown. The financial guillotine had fallen, and in its wake, the power structure of the House of Windsor had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The heir was no longer waiting for the future. He was actively creating it, leaving those who had attempted to undermine him isolated in the fading light of an old world. This systemic pivot directly exposed the profound vulnerability of King Charles III, who found himself increasingly trapped in an agonizing diplomatic no-man's land at the very center of his own palace. The reigning monarch, whose physical stamina remained severely compromised by his ongoing oncology treatments, was caught in a psychological pincer movement. On one side stood the unyielding ambitions of his wife, Queen Camilla, who sought to secure her family's legacy. On the other side stood the iron-willed authority of his son and heir, Prince William, who was already governing the future of the realm with a clinical, modern hand. For a king who had spent a lifetime waiting to assume the crown, the realization that his reign was being structurally overshadowed by a fierce internal war was a source of immense private grief. Courtiers within the royal apartments noted that Charles privately recognized the validity of William's desire to protect his family. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the toll that the relentless gaze of the media could take on a young household. Yet, the king's lifelong struggle with insecurity, a deep-seated jealousy of his son's immense popularity, prevented him from calling off the media attack dogs managed by Tobit Andre. Charles had spent decades in the shadow of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and now, just as he had finally stepped into the light, he felt the cold shade of William and Catherine's public affection falling over him once again. Camilla continuously worked to exacerbate these feelings of insecurity. Behind the closed doors of their private quarters, she would whisper into the king's ear, framing William's domestic focus as a deliberate attempt to make the reigning monarch look ancient and out of touch by comparison. She argued that while Charles was laboring through his treatments and still attempting to fulfill the duties of a sovereign, the 43-year-old Prince of Wales was essentially hiding away, letting the institution crumble. This was the fuel that fed the fire of the Daily Mail hit job, a narrative designed to force William out into the open or, failing that, to diminish his standing in the eyes of the British people. However, the Queen's attempt to paint William as a detached and lazy prince completely collapsed when confronted with the stark reality of the ongoing family crises. The British public is far more perceptive than the media strategists at Buckingham Palace gave them credit for. Deeply aware of the harrowing health challenges facing Catherine, the Princess of Wales, the population viewed William's determination to remain in the United Kingdom not as a neglect of duty, but as an act of profound devotion and mature leadership. They saw a husband who was willing to prioritize his wife's delicate post-chemotherapy recovery over the performative optics of international travel. William's refusal to leave Catherine's side resonated powerfully, with a population that increasingly valued genuine family solidarity over hollow public relations displays. By choosing to prioritize his role as a supportive husband and a father to George, Charlotte, and Louis, William successfully redefined the concept of royal duty for the 21st century. He demonstrated that the future king was willing to endure vicious media slander, even from his own stepmother's camp, in order to safeguard the emotional and physical well-being of his immediate household. The lazy narrative did not stick because the public saw the work he was doing at home as the most important work a man could do. This protective stance extended directly to the wider royal circle, solidifying William's role as the de facto protector of the legitimate bloodline. The Prince of Wales worked in absolute tandem with Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, ensuring that the younger generation of royals who genuinely dedicated their lives to service were shielded from the toxic machinations of the Queen's non-royal faction. William made it known through discreet aristocratic channels that any attempt to diminish the status of Lady Louise Windsor would be treated as an act of open hostility against Kensington Palace itself. This powerful internal alignment completely paralyzed Camilla's ability to manipulate the court hierarchy. As the absolute reality of this systemic isolation settled over the Queen's apartments, the psychological toll on King Charles became impossible for palace courtiers to ignore. He watched with immense grief as his household was torn apart. He found himself entirely cut off from his trusted brother and sister-in-law, Edward and Sophie, who refused to compromise on the absolute protection of their daughter Louise. The king's lifelong dream of a unified, harmonious court that seamlessly bridged the gap between his mother's historic legacy and his own modern vision had vanished. Charles was now a king in name, but he was losing the battle for the institution's soul. He sat at the center of a palace war where his own authority was being systematically marginalized by an heir who had already secured the loyalty of the most important working members of the family. The king's exhaustion was not just physical. It was the weariness of a man who realized that the tabloid assassin he had allowed into his inner circle had only succeeded in burning down the bridges Charles needed to maintain his own legacy. As the grand spectacle of trooping the color approached, the internal dynamic had fundamentally shifted, leaving the king and queen facing a total systemic blockade from the very family they had attempted to undermine. The crown was heavier, than it had ever been, and for the first time, Charles could see that the true power had already moved down the line of succession. The profound collapse of Queen Camilla's media offensive as the middle of June 2026 unfolds has fundamentally redrawn the geopolitical and institutional landscape of the British state, establishing a permanent structural reality that will dictate the transition of power for decades to come. The grand illusion of a harmonious, unified palace apparatus has been completely shattered, replaced by an unforgiving, hyper-efficient architecture of power controlled entirely by the unified front of Kensington Palace and the Edinburgh faction. This newly solidified alliance has effectively taken over the day-to-day administrative governance of the monarchy, transforming themselves into a highly resilient superstructure that completely isolates the current king's apartments and insulates the historical line of succession from any future infiltration by non-royal bloodlines, or opportunistic media strategists. The strategic failure of Tobin André's briefing campaign has resulted in the total neutralization of his executive influence within the royal household, leaving his position as Queen Camilla's Director of Communications completely untenable. Senior officials within the Foreign Office and the wider civil service have quietly moved to cut off André's access to high-level state planning committees, recognizing that his deep, systemic entanglement with the tabloid press poses an unacceptable risk to the stability of the crown during a sensitive period of transition. By allowing his deep personal loyalty to Camilla to override his institutional responsibilities to the state, André has effectively destroyed his own professional credibility, ensuring that his career will be remembered as a classic study in royal overreach and tactical miscalculation. The media infrastructure he once controlled with absolute confidence has turned against his methods, leaving the Queen without a viable press apparatus to defend her remaining institutional interests. For Queen Camilla and Laura Lopes, the structural consequences of this failed palace gamble are absolute and irreversible. The ironclad decree issued by Prince William has effectively closed the door on any future role for the Lopes lineage within the working dynamic of the House of Windsor. Laura Lopes has been permanently excluded from any official state planning, ensuring that she will never receive public recognition, tax-funded security, or the prestigious patronages she and her mother so desperately sought to secure. This complete exclusion serves as a stark, public message to any outsiders who wish to exploit the temporary physical vulnerabilities of the royal family for personal elevation or factional advantage. The Queen herself faces a deeply isolated future within the court, as her relationships with the senior, working members of the family have been permanently poisoned by her calculated willingness to weaponize the private lives of bloodline royals against the stability of the crown. The British public, far from being swayed by the subtle insinuations that William was an indifferent or work-shy heir, reacted with deep indignation toward what was widely perceived as a cruel, coordinated briefing campaign originating from within Buckingham Palace. This public anger was further intensified by a profound wave of collective empathy for Lady Louise Windsor, whose humble, diligent work ethic at the Royal Windsor Horse Show stood in stark, favorable contrast to the sudden, aggressive promotion of Laura Lopes. Rather than engineering a viable path for Laura to secure an official foothold within the tax-funded apparatus of the working monarchy, Camilla's maneuvers instead succeeded in drawing an intense, unforgiving spotlight onto her own family's lack of constitutional standing. Lady Louise Windsor has emerged from this intense palace crisis as a highly respected, deeply revered symbol of genuine royal service and modern resilience. The public's collective response to the cruel, calculated attacks on her character has transformed her into a highly valued institutional asset for the future of the monarchy. Her unyielding dedication to her studies at the University of St. Andrews, combined with her quiet, grounded continuation of Prince Philip's carriage-driving legacy, has demonstrated to the British establishment that true royal authority is sustained through humble service and historical reverence rather than engineered media campaigns. The profound empathy and admiration she now commands across the United Kingdom and the wider Commonwealth have permanently validated the protective instincts of her mother, Sophie, and the clinical defensive maneuvers of her cousin, Prince William. As the absolute reality of this systemic isolation settled over the Queen's apartments, the profound psychological toll on King Charles III became impossible for palace courtiers to ignore. The reigning monarch found himself entirely cut off from his trusted brother and sister-in-law, Prince Edward and Sophie, who refused to compromise on the absolute protection of their daughter. The king's lifelong dream of a unified, harmonious court has vanished, replaced by an unforgiving palace war, where his own authority is being systematically marginalized by an heir who is already governing the future of the realm with an iron will. The strategic alliance between Kensington Palace and Bagshot Park was not merely a defensive pact, it quickly evolved into a coordinated institutional counteroffensive that has redefined the crown. As the United Kingdom finalizes its preparations for the grand displays of the Betfred Derby and Trooping the Colour, the true centres of power within the British monarchy have been undeniably redefined. The king, though remaining the supreme legal and constitutional head of state, sits at the center of a court that has already moved past his traditionalist doctrines. The future of the realm belongs entirely to the modern, impact-driven vision of Prince William and the unwavering protective stewardship of the Duchess of Edinburgh. Together, they have successfully defended the structural integrity of the crown, ensuring that the House of Windsor will enter its next historical chapter as a lean, deeply purposeful institution that prioritizes genuine public service, absolute familial loyalty, and the unyielding protection of those who are truly chosen to serve the state. The era of the tabloid-driven court is over. The era of the Iron Heir has begun.